Today we're going to be moving on to continuing with hand building, but we're going to move on to a new technique, slab. Alright, and slab is just what the name implies. You roll out a thin sheet of clay and you use that sheet of clay to make your project. We are going to be making a mug using the slab technique, and let me show you the tools we're going to be using. First thing you want to do is find some kind of a cylinder, and in this case I've got a tennis ball canister, and I've wrapped paper towels around it and I've taped the paper towels together. You want to make sure that you're not taping the paper towels to the canister. You want to be able to slide those off. You're going to need just a regular rolling pin. If you've got one in your kitchen, that's fine. We're going to use what's called a fettling knife, which is just a dull tapered blade. If you don't have a fettling knife, you can use a butter knife, which is fine. I'm going to use just a regular kitchen fork. Alright. And then I've got a paintbrush to apply my slip, which I've mixed up here in just an old butter tub. And slip is just a mixture of clay and water. And this is the glue I'm going to use to hold my mug together. And then I've just got various tools here, loop tool, just a modeling tool, and then I've got what's called a rib. Alright, and this is just a piece of rubber, very flexible. Ribs can also be made out of metal or wood, and if you don't have a rib, you can use the back of a spoon, whether a wooden spoon or a metal spoon. Alright, to start our mug, you want to roll out your slab of clay, and you want to flatten it first with your hands like you would if you were handling pizza dough. So flatten it as much as you can with your hand. This just makes it easier to roll out when you go to use the rolling pin. So let me get my tools out of the way. When you go to roll your slab, start in the middle and work your way out. Try not to roll from one side to the other, or you're going to end up with a big lump in the middle of your clay. And if you stand up, it works a little better, because you can put your body weight into it. Each time you roll your slab, you want to flip it, and that ensures that your clay does not stick to your board. And you want to roll this slab out to between 1/4 and 1/2 inch thick. Alright, so that looks pretty good. Flip that one more time. If you're not sure if it's long enough, take your can, roll it around, and we've got plenty of room there, so we're good to go. Alright, now I want to use my fettling knife, and I want to start trimming the edges of my mug. So we'll start with the bottom edge. And I just want to trim a straight line. Any excess clay I'm going to roll up into a ball, because I don't want my clay to dry out. And then I want this to be a pretty tall mug. So I'm going to take my canister and kind of measure it compared to the paper on my mug. And now this looks pretty tall. This looks pretty good. Alright, so again I want to do another straight line. If you think you're going to have a problem doing a straight line, use a ruler. Just line your knife up against the edge of a ruler. Alright. Now I want to do the back edge here at the side. And I'm going to wait to cut my last edge. I want to roll this around the canister, and I want my clay to overlap, and that's where I'll cut it. Okay. And then I'm going to hold on to this. I'm going to use this eventually for the bottom of my mug. Now, at this point, I'm going to use my slip. Anytime you join two pieces of clay together, you want to make sure you're doing what's called scoring and slipping the clay. So I'm going to use my fork to score the clay, and all I'm doing is roughening up the surface of the clay. When I add my slip to this, rather than two smooth pieces putting together, it's going to join like this, so it's a tighter fit. So I'll add my slip, and you want to be pretty generous with your slip. Don't be afraid to use too much. You can always wipe it off. And then we'll roll that over. Get rid of the excess there. You can kind of see it oozing out here. That's fine. And I'm just going to use my finger to start blending this clay together. And then at this point I can use my rib and start smoothing that out. So that eventually we can't even really tell that there's two pieces joined there. It should just be nice and smooth. Okay. And now we're ready to do the bottom of the mug. Again, if you look at this, you can see that we need to put a bottom edge on there. So we'll take our extra clay that we had earlier, and it's the same thickness as our mug. If you have to roll out extra clay, maybe you didn't have this extra clay, you want to roll it out so it's about the same thickness as the top part of your mug. Alright, so I'll set this on here, and I'm going to cut this about 1/4 of an inch larger than the actual mug, and that gives me a little bit of clay to work with to blend in. Alright, and I'm joining two pieces of clay together again, so what do I have to do? I have to score and slip my clay together. So I'll come to the bottom here by fork. And we'll score that, and we'll score the bottom piece here. Now whenever I do this project, students always ask, you know, am I really going to be able to drink out of this mug? And yes, as long as you're using a lead-free glaze at the end, you can use this mug. The only thing I wouldn't recommend doing is putting it in the microwave, and probably not the dishwasher. Okay, so now we want to connect this. Go ahead and press it firmly into the bottom piece, but be careful that you don't flatten it. And then I want to, again, take my fingers and start blending this together. I like to roll it on the board just to help flatten that edge out. And you can also take your rib and use that to smooth your clay. For this particular style of mug, you don't really want to have a line at the bottom. It should look like one piece of clay. So we shouldn't be able to tell that we took a piece and blended it at the bottom. Alright, so that looks pretty good. So I'm going to set this to the side for a minute, and we're going to work on the handle. Now, there are different types of handles you can do. You can do a coil handle. You can do a slab handle. I'm partial to what's called a gooseneck handle. And let me get an example here. This is an example of a gooseneck handle. All right, it's that kind of that fancy, little fancier handle. If you've ever milked a cow or pulled taffy, this should be fairly easy for you. If you've never done that, it might be a little more difficult. But you want to start by wedging your clay together. And then you want to pound your clay into a rectangular, kind of a rectangular cone shape, where one end is a little bit bigger than the other end. We got an awful lot of clay there, so I'm going to cut some. Okay, so the bigger end is the end you're going to hold on to. The smaller end is the end you're going to be pulling the clay from. When you make a gooseneck handle, you're going to need a bucket of hot water. It doesn't have to be so hot that you can't put your hand in it, but hotter water works better than cold water. You want to make sure that you keep your clay and your hand wet, because you're stretching the clay, and if you start to get the clay really dry, you're going to end up breaking your handle. So you want to, that's what you want this water for, to keep the moisture there. Alright, and you want to start by putting a groove in the front of this handle. And you can see that on the example here. There's a groove here. And what that does, when you grab that mug, it's just, it gives you a little extra to hold on to there. A gooseneck handle fits really nicely in your hand, and that little dent there in the handle, really, it feels really nice. It's aesthetically pleasing, and it's tactile pleasing. Okay, so I'm going to start pulling this clay. Again, I want to keep the clay wet, I want to keep my hand wet. And as I'm pulling down on the clay, I'm applying some pressure. And it's forcing the clay to stretch downward. Now, if you're making this for a man, you can leave your handle a little wider. Or if you're a man and you're making it for yourself. If you're making it for a girl or a woman, you can make the handle a little slimmer. Since generally, you're going to have smaller hands. So whoever you're making it for, try and make the handle fit that person. And you can see this is starting to get longer. It's starting to look like a big tongue or a big piece of taffy. I always tell my students it looks like a big cow's tongue. Okay, so that looks pretty good. And you can see I've still got that dent there, that ridge. And I'm going to let this dry for a little bit, so I'll set this here. And we're going to move this over to the side. And let that dry for a bit before we attach it. Now, ideally, you'd want to let your mug dry until it gets to the point where it's called leather hard. And leather hard, it's still soft enough to work with, but it's dried enough that it's not going to collapse when you take the canister out. This is actually a little bit too wet to do that, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on. When you pull this out, if the paper comes out with it, great. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. You can go ahead and pull that paper out next. You want to make sure that you take this out, though, before the clay starts to get too dry. Because once the clay starts drying, the water is going to start evaporating out of it, and the clay is going to start to shrink. And if it's shrinking around the canister, it's not going to have anywhere to go, so your mug's going to start cracking. So don't leave that in there too long. Alright, if we look at the inside of our mug, you can see that there's a seam of clay going down where we combine the two sections, okay? If your hand is small enough, you can put your hand in there and start blending that. But maybe your hand's too big to fit down in there, so you can use the handle of a fettling knife, okay? And you can just reach that down in there and start blending that seam together. You want to make sure, though, that you're holding onto the clay outside, because you don't want to push that, you don't want to push your mug out of shape. So whenever you exert pressure on the inside, you want to exert the same pressure on the outside. And then you want to blend that. And I'll show you what that looks like in just a minute. I'll kind of blend where the bottom meets the sides also. Alright, and then right here, you'll notice that seam has been blended in now. Alright. Now, you're making a mug, and a mug is something that you want to drink out of, so you want to make sure there are no sharp edges. So as we look at the top of this, I used a fettling knife to cut this, so it's going to have a really straight, sharp top, and we need to round that. So just using your fingers, you want to come in and you want to start rounding off the edge so that it's got a curved edge on the inside and the outside. Even if you don't think you're going to use it to drink out of, if you're making a mug, it should be, you know, at least look like it's usable. And a lot of students make these and then decide they want to use them as pencil holders or something. But if you're saying you're making a mug, then that edge should be rounded. And it just gives it a more finished look. All right? It'll take a few minutes to round this off. Kind of see as I'm going along here, I'm getting these little fuzzy pieces of clay. If you let your clay get leather hard, you're not going to end up with those. And if you get a lot of them, once your clay starts to dry, you can just brush them off. So don't worry about those. Alright, I've got a little lump over here. I'm going to try and even this out a little bit. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Now I could spend some more time, you know, smoothing this out and whatnot, but just for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on. And I want to start thinking about what kind of a design I'd like to put on this. And you don't need to be real elaborate with your design. I mean, this is a mug. If you want to get very elaborate, that's fine. There are different things you can do. You can carve into your mug for your design. You know, and again, you've got different tools that you can use. Maybe you want to come in and actually use one of the loop tools. You can add things to your mug. Maybe you want to add a design where you roll out another slab of clay and then you add your design on. Remember though, if you're adding on, you want to score and slip your clay together. Okay? I like to just use a simple tool to make a design, and in this case I'll just use my fork again. I'm just going to come in and just make a real simple design going around. And as you're going, if your mug gets knocked out of shape, you can stop and just kind of fiddle with it until you get it back to its right shape. Alright, so now I've got my design. I've got the top of it smoothed out. I'm ready to add my handle. And what do I have to do to add my handle? I have to score and slip it. And again, ideally you'd want to let this get leather hard. My handle's still a little bit wet, but we're going to go ahead and try to connect that. Now I've got this big lump of clay here. Obviously I don't need that big lump of clay as part of my handle, so we can go ahead and cut that off. We'll curve that around. Get rid of that. Let's cut some of this down here. Now it's always better to cut too little off than too much. So you want to start out maybe making your handle a little bit too big and then work from there. Look at there. Got it right the first time. Alright, so that looks pretty good. That looks pretty much in proportion with my mug. I'm just going to cut a little bit flatter edge here so it fits the side of the mug a little better. And then I'm going to score and slip this on. I'll do the same thing on my handle. Get my slip. And again, go ahead and press it firmly into the mug. A lot of times students want to spend all, this time smoothing it out and blending it out, and sometimes that weakens the handle, so you don't want to smooth it out too much. Keep in mind, this is a hand building project, so it shouldn't look like it was done at a factory. Okay, if it's hand built, we're assuming that it's not going to look absolutely perfect. Okay. Probably bring that handle up a little. That's a little better. Okay, so there you have a mug using the slab technique with the gooseneck handle. And if we look over here, we've got some more examples. At this point, I'd want to let my mug dry, and then I'd fire it, and then I'd glaze it. And over here, we've got some mugs with different types of glaze on them. After you've glazed it, you would fire it again, and the firing would change the composition of the glaze, and it'd turn it into this shiny coating. And at that point, your mug would be ready to use, your beverage of choice. Any questions? No? Okay, we are done.